The war began like a distant thunderstorm, too far to see, too easy to ignore. But by the winter of 1941, it had swallowed Europe whole. Cities fell, languages bled together, and every sound, a footstep, a knock, a whisper, could mean death. In the heart of occupied Poland, a woman walked alone beneath a sky bruised by smoke. Her name was Isabelle Novak, though that wasn't the name on her papers. On those, she was Anna Weiss, a seamstress from Vienna. In truth, she was neither. She was a spy, and a ghost of her own making. Isabelle's beauty was the sort that made people hesitate. Sharp and soft at once, dark curls tucked beneath a wool beret, a face that seemed carved from moonlight, and eyes that caught everything and revealed nothing. She had learned early that beauty was a weapon, sharper than any knife, deadlier than any bullet, if wielded without mercy. That evening, she arrived at the Hotel Edelweiss, the German officers' quarters in Krakow. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she crossed the lobby, a place that smelled of cigars, leather, and power. Soldiers glanced her way, some with hunger, others with suspicion. She met no one's gaze directly. At the front desk, she smiled faintly at the clerk. "For Captain Reinhardt," she said in flawless German. "He's expecting me." The clerk checked a ledger, nodded, and gestured her toward the grand staircase. Isabelle thanked him with a soft tilt of her head, the same gesture she'd practiced in mirrors 1,000 times, then climbed the steps, her heartbeat steady despite the gun concealed in her garter. In room 302, Captain Reinhardt waited by the window, a glass of cognac in one hand and a file in the other. He was tall, blonde, immaculate, the kind of man who believed the world existed to admire him. "You're late," he said, without turning. "I wanted to be worth the wait," Isabelle replied. He smiled, setting his glass down. "And are you?" "That depends," she said, stepping closer, her voice low. "On what you're waiting for." He turned then, and in that moment, as his eyes traced her face, Isabelle saw exactly what she needed to: arrogance, curiosity, and the faintest glimmer of loneliness. All men in power carried that same loneliness like a scent. She knew how to find it. And how to use it. They dined together in his suite, duck, wine, and quiet laughter that didn't reach her eyes. Reinhardt talked of the new Europe, of order and discipline. Isabelle nodded when he spoke, listened when he boasted, smiled when he touched her hand. All the while, she was memorizing everything, names mentioned in passing, details about troop movements, the coded phrases scribbled on the folder by his desk. By midnight, he was drunk. By 1, asleep. And Isabelle was gone. Outside, snow fell thick across the empty streets. Isabelle's boots crunched softly as she moved through the alleyways toward the old cathedral, their meeting point. She slipped inside through the side door, where candles flickered weakly before the shattered altar. A man waited there in the shadows, Father Merrick, his cassock dusted with ash. "Did you get it?" he whispered. She handed him a small microfilm container. Everything Reinhardt had. "But the Gestapo is tightening the net. We may not have much longer." He studied her face. "You should leave, Isabelle. There are whispers about a woman in red working for the resistance. Too many eyes." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "I can't disappear. Not yet." Father Marek's expression softened. "You've already given enough." "No," she said quietly. "Not until he's gone." He knew who she meant. Colonel Victor Stahl. Stahl. The butcher of Warsaw. He was the reason Isabelle's husband was dead, the reason her father had been dragged from their home one night and never seen again. She had promised herself that she would one day stand before Victor Stahl, not as a victim, but as his reckoning. Her network didn't know the full truth. To them, she was Agent Solstice, a courier and informant for the Polish underground. Only she and Father Merrick knew her deeper mission, the one that kept her awake at night, the one that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with vengeance. The next week, Isabelle was summoned again, this time not by Reinhardt, but by Colonel Stahl himself. She stood before his desk in the command office, trying not to show the chill crawling down her spine. Stahl was older than she expected, his hair more gray than white, his eyes colorless and cold as river ice. "You've been assisting Captain Reinhardt, yes," he said, leafing through a dossier. "Your record is impressive." "I try to be useful, Herr Oberst," she replied smoothly. He smiled thinly. "So I see. You speak several languages. Move between circles unnoticed. And yet, we can't seem to find any record of you before 1938. Her stomach turned to stone. Stahl looked up from the file. "Curious, isn't it?" She forced a light laugh. "Before the war, I was nobody. Just a girl with a sewing needle." His gaze lingered on her face, long enough to make her wonder if he saw through every lie she'd ever told. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. "Good," he said, closing the file. "We need more nobodies." That night, she received her new assignment, to accompany Stahl to Berlin, where he was due to attend a military council. Reinhardt would remain behind. It was a risk, an impossible one, but it was also the closest she'd ever come to her goal. If she could reach Berlin, she could reach his private files. His movements. His contacts. And perhaps the proof of what had happened to her husband, Tomasz Novak, who had vanished during one of Stahl's operations. She boarded the night train beneath a blizzard sky, sitting across from Stahl in the first-class compartment. Outside, the countryside passed like a smear of white and gray. Inside, the air was heavy with silence and suspicion. At one point, Stahl poured her a drink. "Tell me," he said, studying her carefully, "what do you think of loyalty?" Isabelle lifted the glass, her voice steady. "It's the most dangerous thing in the world." He chuckled, genuinely amused. "You may be right." Berlin was a city of ghosts. Banners fluttered over broken buildings, music played in cafes while the smell of burning still lingered. Isabelle followed Stahl through the streets, a shadow in a crimson coat, eyes hidden behind a quiet smile. That evening, they attended a military reception at the Hotel Adlon, chandeliers, champagne, and men drunk on victory. Isabelle drifted through the crowd, listening, watching, memorizing faces. Then she saw him. Across the room, near the orchestra, a tall man in civilian clothes, scar on his jaw, eyes that caught hers for half a second before flicking away. Tomasz. Her breath stopped. It couldn't be. He was dead. She had seen the report, the photograph, the burnt tag. And yet, that face. That gaze. She excused herself, slipping through the crowd, but when she reached the corner where he'd stood, he was gone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Stahl's papers lay in his briefcase by the window, locked, but she barely glanced at them. Her thoughts were chaos. If Tomasz was alive, everything changed. The next morning, she followed Stahl to the Reich Ministry, where he attended a closed meeting. Isabelle waited outside in the corridor, pretending to review schedules. And there, across the hall, in a flash of motion, she saw him again. This time, she moved quickly, down the stairs and into a service corridor. "Tomasz," she whispered harshly. The man turned. His face, older now, gaunter, bore the same scar. But his eyes, they were filled with a kind of shock that mirrored her own. "Isabelle," he breathed. She wanted to fall into his arms, to believe this wasn't a trick, but before she could speak, he grabbed her wrist. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "They're watching you. Stahl knows more than he lets on." "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "I am," he said. "To them. And you must stay that way too. Footsteps echoed above, guards. Tomasz pulled her into a maintenance room, closing the door softly. Listen to me, he said urgently. Stahl is planning a purge, resistance cells in Krakow, Warsaw, Lublin. You have to get word out. There's a list, in his case. Get it. Whatever it takes. He looked at her then, really looked, and his voice softened. You're still the bravest thing I ever knew. And then, before she could reply, he was gone, slipping through a side door and vanishing into the chaos of the ministry. That night, Isabelle made her choice. She would open Stahl's briefcase. And she would destroy him. While he slept, she moved silently to the window table. The lock was simple, she had practiced on harder. Within seconds, the latch clicked open. Inside, reports, coded memos, and at the bottom, a folder marked Action Morgenstern. Her heart sank as she read. It was a death list. Hundreds of names. The network. Marek. The children they'd smuggled. Everyone. A floorboard creaked behind her. Couldn't sleep? Stahl's voice asked quietly. She turned slowly. He was awake. And his pistol was already raised. The silence between them was so sharp it seemed to hum. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice. Isabelle didn't move. Her pulse thundered in her throat, but her voice, when it came, was calm. I couldn't sleep, she said softly. I was thirsty. Stahl's gaze flicked to the open briefcase. Thirsty, he repeated, his tone almost amused. You chose an interesting remedy. He took one slow step forward, the gun unwavering. The lamplight caught the steel and sent a shimmer across the room. Isabelle forced her breathing steady. The folder lay open, the names visible. If she could just distract him long enough. Tell me, Stahl said, circling her. When did it start? The lies, the infiltration, the seduction of my officers? Perhaps, she said, tilting her chin, when you started killing my people. He stopped. Your people? Her cover was gone, she could see it in his eyes. Pretending now would only waste the seconds she had left. Yes, she said. Poles. The ones you burned out of their homes. The ones you buried in pits and called statistics. For the first time, his expression changed, not guilt, not even anger, but a faint, reptilian curiosity. You're not the first to call me a monster, he said. But most don't live long enough to do it twice. He gestured with the gun. Stand up. She did. Slowly. Now, Stahl said, you'll tell me who you really are. Or I'll decorate the wall with your brains. Isabelle looked at him, really looked. The lines at his eyes, the iron poise of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. She smiled faintly. You already know who I am. You just don't want to remember my name. His brow furrowed. My husband, she whispered. Tomasz Nowak. You executed him 3 years ago outside Warsaw. He refused to kneel. Recognition flickered, brief but real. Then the faintest shrug. Ah. Another partisan. They all blur together. Something inside her cracked. Then let me remind you what one of them looked like. And before he could blink, she hurled the crystal decanter on the table. It exploded against his shoulder, shards and amber liquid scattering. The gun fired, once, twice, deafening thunder in the confined space. Pain ripped through her arm as she dove behind the desk, grabbing the folder and shoving it beneath her coat. Blood ran hot down her sleeve, but adrenaline drowned everything else. Stahl cursed, struggling up, his aim thrown off. Isabelle kicked the lamp from the table, the room plunged into darkness. The smell of smoke, liquor, and gunpowder filled the air. She threw open the door and ran. The corridor was empty, echoing with the sound of her boots. Guards would come any second. She tore down the staircase, clutching her wounded arm, her mind racing. She needed an exit, fast. Through the grand lobby, past the sleeping porter, out into the icy night. Berlin loomed around her like a labyrinth of stone and light. She ducked into an alley, pressed herself against the wall, and tried to breathe. Snowflakes melted on her cheeks, turning pink where her blood had splattered. Somewhere behind her, alarms began to ring. She had the list. But she had no plan left. By dawn, the city was crawling with patrols. Isabelle had found refuge in the backroom of a bombed bakery near the Tiergarten. She wrapped her wound with a torn tablecloth and stared at the blood seeping through. Her hand trembled, not from pain, but exhaustion. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. A faint knock on the side door froze her. She raised her pistol. "It's me," a voice whispered. "Tomasz." She yanked the door open, pulled him inside, and locked it. He looked worse than before, thinner, shadows under his eyes, his coat caked with soot. But he was alive. "You're bleeding," he said, eyes widening. "Stall," she murmured. "He knows everything." Tomasz shut the shutters. "Then we have to get you out of Berlin tonight. There's a courier train to Prague. If you reach Marek's cell, they can copy the list." She reached into her coat and drew out the folder. "This," she said, "is the list." He took it, flipping through the pages quickly. His face went pale. "God in heaven. These are everyone, even children. That's why I can't leave," she said. "I have to deliver it myself." He met her eyes, fierce and desperate. "You won't make it alive. Neither will they if I don't." For a moment, the world outside seemed to vanish, just the two of them, breathing the same cold air, their hands trembling together over that fragile piece of truth. Then Tomasz leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "We'll do it together. One last time." That night, they moved through Berlin disguised as street cleaners, pushing a cart of rags and soot. Snow drifted thick and silent, muffling every sound. Checkpoint by checkpoint, Tomasz led the way, murmuring the forged codes he'd memorized from stolen documents. Isabelle kept her head low, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Near the railway yard, a column of trucks blocked the road, Gestapo vehicles. Dozens of officers, dogs, lights sweeping. Tomasz cursed under his breath. "They've locked down everything. They must have found the blood in Stahl's suite. Then we find another way." They slipped into a drainage canal, crawling through freezing sludge until they reached the edge of the railyard fence. Isabelle's hands were raw, her wound screaming, but she didn't stop. Through the grating ahead, they could see the train, gray carriages marked with supply insignia. Somewhere inside was freedom, and the chance to save hundreds of lives. Tomasz cut through the wire with a stolen tool. They climbed through. A searchlight swept past, they froze. "Go," he hissed. "Now." She ran, darting between the cars, ducking low, her coat soaked with mud and blood. Tomasz followed close behind. They reached the rear of the train. Isabelle pulled open the latch, climbed inside, and turned back just in time to see Tomasz shove her down. "Stay down," he shouted. Gunfire ripped through the air. Dogs barked. Soldiers shouted. "Tomasz," she screamed. He fired back twice, then fell, the flash of bullets illuminating his face one last time. The train began to move. Someone up front had mistaken the chaos for a signal. Isabelle reached out through the open door, her cry lost to the wind, as Tomasz's body disappeared into the darkness. She wanted to jump after him, but then she saw the folder, still clutched in her hand. He had died to give her one more chance. Hours later, the train crossed the border. Isabelle slipped off near Ostrava, hiding in the ruins of a farmhouse until dawn. The pain in her arm was unbearable now, fever creeping in. But she pressed on, walking for miles until she reached a small convent nestled in the hills. The nuns took her in without questions. When she woke again, days had passed. Her arm was bandaged, the snow outside melted to slush. On the nightstand lay the folder, untouched, and a note written in careful handwriting. "We found this in your coat. The world should know." Below it, the seal of the local resistance. She closed her eyes and let the tears come. Months passed. The war raged on, cities burned and fell, borders shifted like shadows. Isabelle never saw Tomasz again, but the list reached London, smuggled through underground couriers, copied, printed, broadcast to the world. The name Victor Stahl became synonymous with atrocity. And when the war ended, when trials began, Isabelle was summoned to testify. She stood in the courtroom in Nuremberg, frail but unbroken, facing the man who had haunted every nightmare. Stahl looked smaller now, gray, hollow, trembling behind the glass of the defendant's box. "You knew," the prosecutor said. "You ordered these operations." Stahl's eyes met hers across the room. For a fleeting second, there was recognition again, the echo of the night in Berlin. "I was following orders," he said. Isabelle's voice was soft, but steady. "So was I." And with that, she turned away. After the trial, she returned to Krakow. The city was half rebuilt, the air thick with memory. Father Merrick met her at the old cathedral steps, older now, but alive. "You did what few ever could," he said, taking her hands. "You carried truth through hell itself." She smiled faintly. "Truth doesn't belong to me. I only borrowed it." In her small apartment, she hung a photograph, a black and white portrait of Tomasz taken before the war. She lit a candle beneath it every night. Sometimes she painted him again, over and over, his face fading into the light. One painting she never finished, the two of them walking through snow toward a horizon that never quite appeared. Years later, when she was old and the world had changed again, a journalist came to interview her. He asked if she had ever regretted what she'd done, the lies, the blood, the loss. Isabelle thought for a long time. "Regret?" she said finally. "No. Only remembrance. Regret is for the living. I've been both dead and alive too many times to tell the difference." The journalist left, shaken by her calm. That night, she sat by the window, snow falling softly outside. She opened her journal and wrote a single line before closing it forever. "Beauty is not what they saw in me. It was the mask I wore to survive them." She blew out the candle. And in the quiet, the world went still again. The war ended, but the silence that followed was worse. Europe exhaled, and what remained was rubble, cities without names, graves without markers, faces without smiles. Victory had a taste like ashes. For Isabelle Novak, peace arrived not as celebration, but as confusion. After years of running, hiding, surviving, she no longer knew what to do with stillness. Her body healed, but her spirit did not. In 1947, she returned to Warsaw, what was left of it. The streets she once knew were unrecognizable, burned-out shells of buildings, walls scribbled with dates of death, the faint smell of lime and earth. Children played in the ruins, their laughter echoing through hollow windows. She rented a single room above a bookstore that had somehow survived the bombs. The owner, a kind old man named Jakub, never asked about her past. He only noticed that she read constantly, philosophy, poetry, even German novels, as if trying to stitch her mind back together with words. Every morning she walked to the river, carrying a satchel filled with paints. She began painting again, not people, not faces, but fragments, a glove on a chair, a broken violin, a window lit by invisible fire. Pieces of memory she could not throw away. At night, she dreamed of Tomasz, sometimes alive, sometimes dying, sometimes just turning away into snow. She'd wake before dawn, whispering his name into the dark, as though sound alone might summon him back. And always, she dreamed of the folder. The list. The hundreds of names. She wondered how many of them lived because she didn't die that night. She wondered if it was worth it. The world was rebuilding, or pretending to. Trials continued in Nuremberg, then in smaller courts across Europe. The papers printed names of the guilty and the hanged. But for every one punished, 10 more vanished into the wind, changing names, countries, allegiances. One morning, Jakub handed her a letter with a foreign stamp. It bore no sender's name, only a mark she hadn't seen in years, a small hand-drawn sunburst. The Resistance's old symbol. Inside was a single sentence. Stahl escaped. She dropped the letter, her pulse hammering. For years, she had imagined him rotting behind bars, reduced to dust and regret. But the world was shifting again, borders redrawn, loyalties bought and sold. The Americans were fighting the Soviets now, and men like Stahl were useful to both sides. Useful monsters survived longest. That night, Isabelle packed a small bag and took the train west. Berlin was a different city now, divided, restless, haunted. Half under Soviet occupation, half gorging itself on the promise of capitalism. The same hotels still stood, though the flags had changed. She stayed in a boarding house near Friedrichstrasse, using a new name, Clara Weiss, widow, translator. She had grown thinner with the years, but her beauty remained, sharper now, like the edge of glass. She began asking quiet questions. About former officers. About disappearances. About who had slipped through the cracks of justice. Most people shrugged her off. A few warned her to stop. But one night, in a smoky cafe near Alexanderplatz, a contact finally spoke the name she had been waiting for. Stahl? He's here, the man whispered. Americans have him. They call it Operation Paperclip, they're taking scientists and officers west. New identities. New work. Where? The man glanced around nervously. Tempelhof. He leaves in 3 days. Isabelle paid him and left without another word. The next morning, she stood outside the Tempelhof terminal, watching trucks come and go under armed guard. Snow fell softly, muffling the noise. Officers laughed, smoked, carried crates marked U.S. property. And there, stepping out of a black car, older, slower, but unmistakable, was Victor Stahl. He wore civilian clothes now, but carried himself with the same arrogance. His hair was gray, his shoulders stooped, yet something in his face was unchanged, the unbroken certainty of a man who believed history would forgive him. For a long time, Isabelle didn't move. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, sometimes with a gun in her hand, sometimes with a confession on his lips. But standing there now, she only felt empty. Then, from the corner of her vision, she saw a child, a girl no older than 10, selling flowers by the road. A soldier passed, took one, tossed a coin. The child smiled. Something in that small act, so ordinary and human, pulled Isabelle back from the edge of vengeance. She lowered her gaze, turned away, and followed Stahl instead. He stayed in an American-run guesthouse on the outskirts of the city, under heavy guard but with all the comforts of privilege. Isabelle watched from a distance for 2 days, memorizing routines, guard rotations, lights. On the third night, she made her move. She approached from the back, through a grove of bare trees, the cold biting through her gloves. The side door was locked, but she'd learned long ago that nothing built by men stayed locked forever. Inside, the hallways smelled of bleach and whiskey. She moved silently, her pistol heavy in her pocket, until she reached his room. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. Stahl sat at the desk, alone, reading a report. He didn't look up. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The years between them filled the air like fog. Finally, he said, "You've aged well." "Better than you," she replied. He closed the file and turned in his chair. "Do you plan to kill me?" She hesitated. "Would it change anything if I said yes?" "Not for me," he said calmly. "But for you, perhaps." She stepped closer. "You killed my husband." "I killed many husbands," he said. "And wives. And children. It was war. War doesn't make murder righteous. It makes it inevitable." She wanted to shoot him then, wanted to erase the years with a single sound, but her hand trembled. Stahl noticed. "You're not built for vengeance," he said softly. "You're built for survival. There's a difference." She looked into his pale eyes, the same ones that had watched people die without flinching, and realized something terrifying. He believed every word. "You'll die anyway," she said quietly. "One day, history will finish what I can't." He smiled faintly. "History doesn't kill. It forgets." She left without firing the gun. Outside, the snow had stopped. A single plane took off overhead, bound for America, carrying men like him toward new beginnings. She stood there until it vanished into the clouds, then turned her back on it forever. For the first time, she didn't feel anger. Only exhaustion, vast and endless. Months later, she was in Paris. The war trials had faded from headlines, replaced by reconstruction, fashion, and jazz. The world was pretending to be alive again. Isabelle found work translating survivor testimonies for a museum project. Each day, she sat at a desk and typed stories of horror, women from Ravensbrück, men from Auschwitz, children from Lodz. Their words passed through her fingers like ghosts. At night, she would walk along the Seine, notebook in hand, writing fragments of thoughts she never spoke aloud. We think survival is the opposite of death. It isn't. It's the continuation of it. I no longer know what forgiveness means. Perhaps it means living in silence. One evening, as she sat by the river sketching, a young man approached, dark hair, camera slung over his shoulder. "Excuse me," he said in hesitant French. "Are you the artist who painted the Warsaw Windows exhibit?" She looked up, surprised. "You've seen it?" "It made me cry," he said simply. "My mother was in Warsaw too." He hesitated, then smiled. "May I photograph you?" "For the collection." She wanted to refuse, but something in his earnestness disarmed her. She nodded. He raised his camera. "Look at the water," he said. "As if you're seeing something far away." She did. The shutter clicked. When he lowered the camera, she saw a reflection of Tomasz for a brief, impossible moment, his eyes, his gentleness. "Merci," she whispered. The young man smiled. "No. Thank you." Years passed again. Isabelle grew older, her hair turning silver, her hands stiff from the cold. She moved south, to Provence, where the air was warm and the olive trees whispered like old friends. She lived quietly in a small stone house, painting whenever her health allowed. The neighbors knew her as Madame Weiss, the widow who rarely left her garden. But the world hadn't forgotten her completely. Sometimes letters arrived, students asking for her memories, journalists writing about the resistance. She answered few. In one, she wrote, "The war was not fought between nations. It was fought inside people, between what they loved and what they feared." Another. "There is no heroism in surviving. Only endurance. Heroism belongs to the dead." In the winter of 1963, a visitor came. An American diplomat, young and nervous, carrying a briefcase and too much politeness. "Madam Weiss," he said, "I come on behalf of the Department of Justice. We've located Victor Stahl." Her breath caught. "He's in Buenos Aires," the man continued. "Under a false name. We're preparing extradition." Isabelle looked out the window at the vineyard below. The sun was setting, staining everything gold. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because your testimony could help convict him again." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "He's an old man now. Let the earth deal with him." The diplomat nodded uncertainly. "Do you forgive him, madam?" She smiled faintly. "No. But I forgive myself for not killing him." That night, she took out her paints for the first time in years. She began a new canvas, a woman standing in snow, her back to the viewer, watching an airplane vanish into clouds. Around her, faint shapes emerged, faces of those she'd lost, eyes of those she'd saved. When it was finished, she titled it Solstice. She hung it by the window, where the morning light would touch it first. In her final years, Isabelle kept a diary. Small, fragile entries written in ink that sometimes blurred from tears. She wrote not of war, but of small things, the sound of rain, the smell of bread, the way the wind moved through olive trees. Her last entry read, "Peace is not the absence of war. It is the moment you stop hearing its echo inside yourself." She passed away quietly one spring morning, sunlight streaming through the curtains, the fields outside bursting with color. When the neighbors found her, they discovered the painting Solstice still hanging where she'd left it, and beside it, a sealed envelope addressed to the Museum of Memory, Warsaw. Inside was a single line written in her hand. "For those who remember when the world forgot." Years later, her painting hung in the museum's central hall. Visitors paused before it, drawn by its quiet power. A small plaque beneath bore her real name, Isabelle Novak, 1917 to 1964, and a brief description. Resistance courier, artist, survivor. She carried truth through fire. Sometimes, schoolchildren would ask the guide why the woman in the painting had her back turned. And the guide would smile gently and say, "Because she's still walking, toward the light that war could never reach."